My dear students, welcome to this massive open online course on Development Economics 2. Today we shall discuss Globalization in Historical Perspective, Part 3. Now, after the completion of this module, you will be acquainted with some of the basic benefits and defects of the process of economic globalization. You can understand the basic determinants of the process of globalization, namely economic globalization. You will be capable of identifying the process of the present globalization, and you will also develop a clear idea regarding the future path to be followed for making globalization a fair game for most of the countries of the world. Now, already you have completed 2 modules on globalization and you have already developed some idea regarding globalization. Just for a recapitulation of what we have already discussed, let us first define in a definite way what is actually globalization. Globalization can be considered as a process of closer integration of different countries of the world along with their people throughout the globe, which has been brought about by the enormous, reduction in the costs of transportation and communication. That means they are now very much close-knit. All the countries, the people of different countries of the world, they are now very much close together, particularly in this present age of artificial intelligence and the Internet of Things. You can well understand how they are closely knit. So that is the flavor of globalization. That means you can think beyond your border. Now, it also implies, that means the globalization also implies the breaking down of artificial barriers to the flows of goods and services, to the flows of capital, and to some extent to the flow of physical, human labor across border. And the process of globalization has actually helped in the development of a strong and complex global supply chain, or what is alternatively called as global value chain. What is global supply chain or global value chain? Global supply chain is a concept where to produce any particular product, different countries are involved. It is not just like what you have studied at your international trade. That means in case of, for example, the Ricardian comparative cost advantage theory, where Ricardo suggested that a country should produce only those commodities in which it has a comparative cost advantage. But now, at present, in the age of globalization, that concept has completely changed. Now, some product, the design is built in one country, different spare or the components of that particular commodity are being produced at different corners of the globe, and ultimately all those components are being assembled in a particular country. So you can well imagine how that supply chain is constructed. We shall discuss that supply chain within a few moments. And globalization, what we have observed, it has been accompanied by certain new institutions, which are actually working along with the existing institutions. For example, you can think of Jubilee movement, a particular movement, we call it Jubilee Movement 2000, which is working along with the Red Cross Society. What is the objective of Jubilee Movement 2000? The objective was to reduce the debt burden of the poor and developing countries of the world. So you can think of some of the positive aspects of globalization, where organization, non-government organization, they are now thinking of the welfare of the global community, global society. And this process of globalization, it has also been powerfully driven by some of the transnational corporations or international multinational corporations. And these corporations are instrumental in the flow of or the movement of capital, technology, improved management, etc. Now here in the screen you observe how this global value chain or the global supply chain has been built through the process of globalization. In this slide, but in the left-hand side you observe that global supply chain hub developed by Germany, then there is a hub of China, and there is also a hub of USA. For example, in case of India, you observe India is closely connected with China, and then India is also connected with Nepal, Bhutan, Maldives. For example, in case of Russia, now they are engaged in a war with Ukraine. But the Russia is connected with Germany, and in that supply chain, Russia is also connected with Kazakhstan, Lithuania, Latvia, Cyprus, Kyrgyzstan, etc. So different countries of the world are now well connected, and this creates the global value chain. Okay, I can give you one example. In this screen, I have given one example. Say this electronic bicycle is now produced in Vietnam. But you see, different spare parts of this cycle are being produced by different countries of the world. At least 8 to 9 countries are involved. So, for example, the tires are supplied by Indonesia, the motor is supplied by Germany, the seat is supplied by Italy. So, different spare parts components are being produced by different countries of the world, and ultimately this product is being assembled in Vietnam. So, in this way, the global supply chain through the process of globalization has created an environment where different countries of the world are very much connected, interconnected, interlinked, and they are creating the global value. Okay? So students, we have discussed the concept of global supply chain or global value chain. Now, can you tell me any reason behind the disruption in this global supply chain? Please try yourself. The next one is, the process of globalization has created a renewed attention of long established international or intergovernmental institutions, okay? Just like International Labour Organization or World Health Organization. They are called as intergovernmental institutions. Now, why now there is a renewed importance of ILO? ILO is important now because now in a globalized world, different countries are well interconnected, as I have already said. So they have a program how to develop, say, labor standard, working standard, or the agenda for the decent work for the workers throughout the globe. So ILO is important. Secondly, why World Health Organization is important? Because they now keeps a vigilance over the health part of the society, global society. For example, during COVID, so World Health Organization actually has taken up several programs so as to make a caution, okay, for different countries of the world so that they can follow a particular path to overcome the crisis. So these institutions are becoming more and more important in this process of globalization. And globalization, when we study different say research papers, they have identified that it has created some benefits, some sort of success, particularly in case of East Asian countries, where if you study, you will observe that in East Asian countries during 1960s, 1970s and 1980s, there was enormous increase in say national income and per capita income that has happened in East Asian countries. You can take the example of South Korea. In South Korea, during the process of globalization, we observe an increase in their per capita income by 8-fold almost. And they have almost eliminated the problem of poverty. They have achieved universal literacy. They have improved health standard. That means with the help of globalization, when these countries are connected with the global world, then they have not only gained in terms of growth in terms of output, but also gained in terms of development. That means the development of the physical quality of life, okay? And now the question is, how you can estimate the process of globalization. Now, normally we adopt one particular measure. We call it Trade Openness Index. Now, what is Trade Openness Index? Trade Openness Index is measured by the global export plus global import whole divided by the global GDP. So that is a ratio. If this ratio increases, then that is an indication of globalization. That means Trade Openness Index is a proxy for measuring the global openness or globalization. Here in this diagram I am showing you in this slide, the diagram, this line diagram shows how the Trade Openness Index has gradually increased from 1950s. If you see the data, you observe that in 1950, this index was only to the tune of 19.87. But it has gradually increased up to 23.75. The process was very slow up to, say, mid-1970s. Now you can ask me, why, sir, this slow progress of global openness? It was because in many countries of the world, it has been observed that since mid-70s or late 70s, some of the countries, say, started taking up liberalizing their trade policies. So whenever the countries began to liberalize, began to take up new trade policy, they opened up their economy gradually, then the trade openness increased, and that has been reflected here. For example, in 1980, it has reached up to 40. The index power was 40. But now if you look at the second diagram, it shows the trend of the Trade Openness Index during 1981 to 2021. What do you observe? You observe that during mid-1990s, for example, in 1995, it has just touched that 40 mark index, okay? And why 1995 is important? In January 1995, World Trade Organization was formed. That means from early 1990s, for example, in case of India, India has taken up this new economic policy or liberalization or privatization, and the new policies India took during early 1990s. So different countries of the world, they have taken up these liberalized policies, and as a result, you observe the gradual upward shift in that Trade Openness Index, and that actually reflects the process of globalization. But after reaching a peak of 61.49, for example, here, please see, during 2007-8, it again slide, okay, there was a slide down and a downturn, and gradually, the trend is downward trend. If you think of a linear trend, it was gradually downward sloping, okay? That means trade openness, that speed has declined. Now the question is why? Why it has declined? The first is, I shall discuss it later, but this time you must keep in your mind that this downward trend in the process of globalization was first because of that financial crisis that took place in European countries during 2007-8, and then there was a downward trend in the global business environment, and that was being added by this during COVID period, when different countries of the world, there was a breakage in the global supply chain that I have already explained. So if you observe a break in the global supply chain due to some shock, okay, shock generated out of that huge pandemic, that can lead to the downward slope in the globalization process in the form of slow movement of Trade Openness Index. Now, coming to the role of international institutions in this process of globalization. Now, mainly you can identify three main international institutions, namely International Monetary Fund, World Bank, and World Trade Organization. These three institutions together, they actually shape this process of globalization during the last few decades. Now, since 1980s, IMF and World Bank, along with US Treasury, okay, they have been following a particular neoliberal policy for facilitating this process of globalization. We call it, normally it is called as Washington Consensus. That means they have a consensus regarding the policies to be followed by most of the countries to gain from the process of globalization. Now, what are the basic components of these policies? First is fiscal discipline, very important. What is fiscal discipline? Fiscal discipline is the discipline in the fiscal policies to be taken up by any particular country. For example, in case of India. In case of India, in 2003, the government has adopted FRBM Act. What is FRBM? Fiscal Responsibility and Budgetary Management. That means, according to fiscal discipline, every government has to reduce the deficit, fiscal deficit, so as to maintain a discipline in the fiscal environment in the economy. Now, next is tax reforms. For example, again in case of India, you have observed the tax reform in indirect taxes. For example, from 2017, you have GST instead of host of indirect taxes. So these international institutions, namely IMF and World Bank, they are suggesting that there should be proper tax reforms so as to facilitate the investors, so as to facilitate the entrepreneurs. And these entrepreneurs, these investors, they are very important, foreign investors, very important in furthering the process of economic globalization. The next is market-determined interest rate. Previously, what we observed that the monetary authority, for example, the central bank of a country, for example, in case of India, it is the Reserve Bank of India, they indicated, they determined the interest rate, for example, the repo rate or the reverse repo rate. Now, they suggested, IMF and World Bank suggested that this interest rate should not be determined by the central bank. Rather, this interest rate should be determined by the market forces of supply and demand. That means in the capital market, the demand for capital and the supply of capital together should determine the equilibrium rate of interest. Now, the trade liberalization, it actually means that the trade policy, external trade policy, should be liberalized in the sense that both the tariff and non-tariff barriers should be minimized, and openness to foreign direct investment. Foreign direct investment, when the foreigners invest in the directly productive activities in your country, then you must minimize the restrictions on those inflow of foreign capital. And then the privatization of state enterprises. They suggest that the state government, or the union government should not involve itself in different activities of the economy. It should minimize the activities. It has some particular responsibility in terms of, say, law and order, creating rules and regulations, and facilitating the private entrepreneurs. That is the responsibility of the government. So, the state sector enterprises, where it is not needed, it should be privatized. That was their suggestion. And the next is deregulation. That means from different economic activities, the government control should be reduced. So these are the prescriptions for any particular country so as to facilitate that country to move in the path of globalization. Now, what are the other aspects? Here, the solution provided by IMF and World Bank, if you now estimate or if you now want to review the impact of these suggestions, these rules and regulations provided by or suggested by IMF and World Bank, what we observe, different economists, they are of the opinion that most of, or to some extent, many of these suggestions could not solve the long-run economic problem of many developing economies. For example, in many developing economies, will observe the growing problem of unemployment, the growing problem of income and wealth inequality. These problems, perennial problems, could not be solved with the help of the solutions provided by IMF and World Bank. And what we observed that these World Bank and IMF, they helped the developing countries to just take up the programs of this liberalization, some structural reconstruction of the economy. So they gave structural adjustment loan. For example, in case of India, India also took structural adjustment loan from IMF. Now, if any country takes loan from IMF or World Bank, they have to comply with some of these conditionalities. And one of the most important condition was that the government should reduce its fiscal deficit. That means it must follow the rule of austerity. And what we observe in reality was that when the government has to reduce its expenditure, normally we observed that in many cases the government reduced the expenditure in case of social expenses. For example, in health, in education, in nutrition. If the government reduces the expenditure, then what will happen? The people at large will suffer. So that is the negative aspect of these solutions. And according to these conditionalities, these developing economies, they are to open up their economy. When they open up the economy, then the foreign commodities, they inflow in the country. Then what happens? The indigenous industries which produce import competing goods, they face a tough competition, and it is very difficult to win in that competition because the foreign companies are much more strong than the domestic companies. So these are the negative impacts of globalization. Now, coming to the GATT solution during the Uruguay round, I shall discuss in the subsequent module what is that round. GATT is General Agreement for Tariff and Trade, which was signed by 23 countries in 1948, and the objective was to create an environment in the world economy by reducing the tariff, and a free trade world was the objective. And in the Uruguay round, that means in 1986, that GATT round means the negotiation between the countries. They suggested that now the service in trade in services should be included in this norm, global trade norms, okay? And they suggested that service has to be included. That means from 1948 up to 1994, the world trade, which was guided by the provisions and the norms of GATT, particularly included only merchandise trade. For the first time, they suggested that with the growth in the trade in services, services should also be included. That means the restrictions upon the trade in services should be reduced. Now, economists, they have found that there are some bias. There is discrimination in this policy. Why discrimination? Because they have found that over the few decades, US economy, their manufacturing product, the share of the US manufacturing in total GDP of US was gradually declining, and the share of service sector was increasing. So they required an expanded market for US service. And what service? Financial service. Therefore, what we observed that in case of maritime service or construction services, which required, say, unskilled laborer and the movement of laborer from one country to another, that was not the agenda in the agenda of GATT or WTO. So that was a negative aspect. The US government remained extremely protectionist. Why they remained protectionist? They wanted to protect the industrial economies. And in many WTO, World Trade Organization meetings, it has been observed that these developed and industrial countries, okay, they didn't want to give advantage to the developing and less developed economies so far as the trade in a free global world is concerned, okay? And the next, there is a gap between our expectation from this process of globalization and the actual outcome, okay? We observed that in most of the developing countries, about 70% of the working force, they were engaged in agriculture, in particularly low-income economies. But this OECD countries, Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, mostly the developed European countries, okay, they continued to provide their farmers the subsidy support to the tune of $300 billion each year. That means despite this WTO suggestion, despite this GATT provision, these countries continued to give this subsidy support. Now what will happen if these developed countries give subsidy support? If they give subsidy to their farmers, then their farmers, the farmers of developed economies, they can sell their product at a lower price. So for less developed or developing countries, the farmers will suffer. Despite the wage cost is low in low-income countries, they cannot withstand the competition put forward by the developed countries because they get the support from their government in terms of subsidy, okay? For example, there is green box subsidy, blue box subsidy. These are in disguise, they provide subsidies to their farmers. For example, US government provides subsidies to the cotton growers, huge amount. So the cotton growers of US can sell the cotton at much lower price compared to the cotton sold by Indian farmers, okay? Despite Indian wage rate is lower than that of US. In case of, say, dairy farming, in case of European Union, you cannot imagine that every year this amount of subsidy provided by European Union per dairy sector per cow is more than the per capita European Union aid provided to the sub-Saharan Africa. You can well imagine. So because of this discrimination between the developed country and the developing country, okay, there is a clear segregation, okay, of the process of globalization. That means gain is being shared more by the developed countries and less by the less developed countries. Joseph Stiglitz is a famous name, okay? He's a Nobel laureate. He is of the opinion that since 1980s, okay, we observe this process of globalization has a governance process. The global governance, we observe some few institutions are actually governing this process of globalization. These institutions are namely IMF, the World Bank, and WTO. They dominate in global governance. But he is of the opinion, Stiglitz is of the opinion that we do not have global government. We have governance, but we do not have global government, where these less developed and developing countries can just submit their difficulties. Okay, just what happens in case of a particular country, where the common people can submit their difficulties to the government. Okay, so now what is problem? The problem is the ongoing process of economic globalization. The pace with which it is progressing, it is much higher than the globalization of political, ideologies. So economic globalization outpaced political globalization. So in different countries of the world, the political ideologies are different. Okay, so because of these differences, we are suffering, particularly the less developed and developing countries are suffering in different areas. Okay, now students, we have also discussed the concepts of economic globalization as well as political globalization. Okay, now can you tell me, or can you suggest any procedure for political globalization? These economists also indicate that US government and some other developed countries, they are following the policy of unilateralism rather than multilateralism. That means they are taking up the policy, the trade policy of their own, for their own benefit. For example, US economy, they are opening up their economy for some of the industrialized countries for some particular products, but they are not giving access to developed or less developed and developing countries in their markets. And in IMF also, we observe that US has a special powers. The power is giving veto. So if US gives veto to any particular decision, IMF cannot take the decision. So by the threat of their veto power, sometimes US government, they want to influence the stance taken by the IMF. That means what we observe? We observe that although there is in global governance, in terms of the governance provided by IMF or World Bank, there are also some of the big capitalist countries, they actually dominate these policies. So if they dominate, then what will happen? The outcome is not equalized or equal, facilities for all the governments, both for developed and developing countries. You cannot expect equal treatment. Now, in the recent time, particularly from 2006 onwards up to 2021, what we observe, as I have already told you, a downward trend in this Trade Openness Index. And some economists, they consider it as the process of slow globalization or deglobalization. Okay, here please see this downward trend. In this diagram, it shows that the gradual downward movement of the Trade Openness Index. Okay, now the question is, why this deglobalization trend? There are some reasons. First is the policy taken by the US government. During the period of Donald Trump, the policy was America for the Americans, or America first. That means they wanted to protect their own industries. So instead of taking liberalized policies, they have taken up protectionist policies. And they were engaged in trade war with China. And we have seen consecutively the retaliation and counter-retaliation in terms of the tariff. When the US government put some higher tariff on some of the articles imported from China, China also put higher tariff on articles which they import from USA. So if this continues, it is called decoupling effect. Decoupling effect means this two great world power, they are now segregated, and that leads to a deglobalization process. That means the bilateral trade will decline, the trade openness will decline, and therefore it will arrest the process of globalization. Okay, and the growth of the global value chain will also be disrupted. And we have seen that in China also, during the period of President Xi Jinping, they have also followed the inward-looking policy. They wanted to protect their indigenous industries. Dear students, we have discussed the concept of deglobalization. Okay, so can you suggest any procedure through which there can be in near future a re-globalization? Instead of deglobalization, we can have re-globalization. Now the problem is, if you want to make this process of globalization much more fair, okay, the Stiglitz provided some of the basic solutions. The first is the role of the government should be very much positive. The positive role of the government in terms of their rules and regulations to protect the economically poorer section, the working class, who normally are engaged in unorganized sector. Why? Because this unorganized sector, okay, they are much more susceptible to global fluctuations. If there is a global recession, then they will lose their employment, their income will fall because they are not permanent employees. Okay, so government has to take up some rules and regulation so as to protect the interest of this common, people. They have to provide them with adequate food, shelter, education at affordable prices. Okay, and the workers who actually work in small-scale farms or in affiliates of multinational corporations, they should also get benefit from the government. Okay, and the government should also frame the rules to check the unfair competition in many industries. For example, in case of India, the government of India has enacted the Competition Act to create a competitive environment in an economy. Okay, now we can indicate a particular case of Africa. Often we give the example of sub-Saharan Africa, where we see that despite the process of globalization, different countries of sub-Saharan Africa, they are still poor, very poor. Now, one very famous economist, Paul Collier, okay, he is the professor of economics and director of the Center for the Study of African Economies at Oxford University. He has opined that why this situation in Africa. He is of the view that it is because of poor, this governance in Africa. And in several countries of Africa, he has indicated that the domestic policies and institutions have ruled out manufactured exports, and they have depended too much on those sectors which are producing products from natural resources, on extractive industries without proper governance. So if you depend too much on natural resources where you do not have proper governance, then what is the outcome? And he has indicated that because of internationalization of the crime, it has made Africa's weak governance as commercially much more valuable, creating more powerful lobbies, and that has led to further deterioration in the rule of the law in Africa. So Africa could not benefit from globalization only, particularly because of poor governance. Okay, and he suggests that how we can help Africa. Africa, if it takes up collaborative effort from the local government with the, international civil society in the form of some involvement of global NGOs, just like, Global Witness, which was formed in 1993 to break the links between the natural resources exploitation and the conflict, poverty in any particular country, along with OECD governments, to create an extractive industries transparency initiative in Africa and help Africa to come out of that impasse. Then only Africa can take that benefits from globalization. So these changes are needed. The most important change should be governance. And what we need more is adequate vigilance over the markets where foreign firms have entered. Okay, they can create or vitiate the economy. Vitiate in the sense that the foreign firms, when they are allowed in various markets in the host country, then the government should take up different policies. For example, in the capital market, in insurance market, which observe in India, and there should be proper negotiations with WTO. The less developed countries should put up their claim, and that WTO has also the responsibility to take up the cases with the developed countries. And Jagadish Bhagavati is also of the opinion that this countries, okay, they should have proper wage insurance scheme to help the workers, okay? And the sequencing is most important. When you go through the process of globalization, when to open up economy, that should be the proper kind. In case of China, they gradually opened up the economy and they could benefit maximum from the globalization process. And at last, what we should know, that means in the globalization process, we must create an inclusive, equitable globalization process. We must create a sustainable globalization process. So every country should take up policies so as to make the progress, make the growth much more inclusive, much more sustainable. Okay? And from today's discussion, what we get an idea that how we can estimate the process of globalization through Trade Openness Index, what are the benefits and loopholes of globalization, and what is the meaning of deglobalization, and how we can take proper steps to make the future globalization a fair game for almost all the countries of the world. Thank you very much to attend this module.